close up on a glistening turquoise pool. The low, peaceful hum of the filtration system. The air is still, heavy with the scent of chlorine and summer heat. Sound cuts to the sharp, wrenching metal of a pump being torn from its mount. The air fills with the acrid smell of burnt plastic and ozone. A single drop of motor oil falls into the water, spreading like a stain of dark blood. The camera pans up to a determined face, sweat streaking through the grime. A voice, low and hard, cuts through the silence. "They came for my paradise. I made sure they found a ruin." The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, nestled in a stack of junk mail and utility bills. It was crisp, with the HOA's familiar logo embossed on the top. The stylized roof of a suburban house, flanked by two perfectly manicured trees. Alex tossed it on the counter, his mind still reeling from the long day. But something about the sterile, corporate font of the address label drew his eye back. He ripped it open. The letter, signed by the HOA president, Evelyn Vance, was a model of passive-aggressive bureaucracy, cloaked in the language of community enhancement and collective improvement. It outlined a new initiative to optimize water feature usage within the neighborhood. A convoluted plan that ended with a blunt proposal to integrate private pools into a new, centralized community system. Alex stood there, reading and rereading the words. It didn't make any sense. His pool was his. He had built it himself, sinking 3 years of weekends and nearly every spare dollar he had into turning the patch of scrub grass behind his house into a shimmering oasis. It wasn't a luxury. It was his sanctuary, his place of solace after the long, grueling divorce that had cost him so much. It was where his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, had learned to swim, her small, joyful splashes echoing the slow, steady rhythm of a new life taking shape. Now, this letter. It felt less like a proposal and more like a declaration of war. He went. To the next HOA meeting, armed with legal jargon he'd looked up online and a burning indignation. The community room, normally a place of hushed geriatric politeness, was charged with a tense, expectant energy. Evelyn Vance, a woman who seemed to have weaponized the concept of a power suit, stood at the front, a condescending smile fixed on her face. Her voice was as smooth and unyielding as polished granite as she explained the new bylaws. "We believe," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room, "that a centralized, community-owned pool will not only increase property values, but also foster a deeper sense of unity among our residents." The proposed plan was simple, and in its simplicity, utterly grotesque. The HOA would purchase a select number of private pools, Alex's included, at a fair market value determined by their own committee, and then manage them as a shared resource. The compensation they offered was a fraction of what Alex had spent, not to mention what the pool meant to him. When Alex rose to speak, his voice trembled, but he held his ground. "With all due respect, Evelyn," he began, "this is an illegal land grab. You can't just seize private property because you think it serves a greater good." Evelyn's smile didn't falter. It widened slightly. "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, we are not seizing anything. We are exercising the authority granted to us by our new bylaws, which a majority of this community has already approved." She gestured to a stack of signed papers on the table. "You have the option to accept our offer. Refusal will result in a daily fine for non-compliance, and, as outlined in the new regulations, we will have to pursue other avenues." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat of legal action and financial ruin. Alex looked around the room, expecting someone, anyone, to back him up. But the other residents, his neighbors, looked away, their faces a mixture of fear and disinterest. The emotional stakes of a fight for property were nothing to them compared to the inconvenience of an angry HOA president. He walked out of the meeting a marked man. The next few weeks were a relentless assault. Evelyn and her cronies, emboldened by their victory at the meeting, began a systematic campaign of intimidation. First came the official-looking notices, delivered daily, each one more menacing than the last, detailing the mounting fines. Then came the phone calls, blocked numbers leaving cryptic messages about unresolved community issues. He found a flyer tucked under his windshield wiper that read, "Is your neighbor holding up progress?" The pressure was immense. Alex felt a constant low-level thrum of anxiety. He lost sleep, his appetite vanished, and the once peaceful sight of his pool now only filled him with dread. Lily, sensing his unease, started asking questions. "Daddy, why does that lady want our pool? Can't we just give her some water so she leaves us alone?" Her innocence was a sharp, painful reminder of what he was fighting for. It wasn't just a pool. It was his family's peace, their security, the last bastion of normalcy he had left. One afternoon, standing on the deck, a final certified letter in his hand, Alex felt the slow burn of anger turn to a cold, hard rage. The letter was an ultimatum: comply within 72 hours or face a lien on his home and a legal battle he couldn't afford to fight. He looked out at the shimmering water, the sunlight glinting off its surface like a million tiny diamonds. He thought of Lily splashing in the shallow end, her laughter ringing out across the quiet backyard. He thought of all the blood, sweat, and tears he'd poured into building it. The memories were beautiful, but the future was grim. They were going to take it. They were going to make it into a shared, soulless public amenity, erasing every trace of his personal triumph and turning it into a monument to their petty tyranny. The injustice of it all was a physical weight on his chest. It was the feeling of being cornered, of a life he had painstakingly rebuilt being torn down around him. He could fight them in court, lose his savings, and maybe, just maybe, win. Or he could surrender, hand over his sanctuary for a pittance, and watch it become theirs. A third option, a third way, began to form in the white-hot core of his fury. A path of scorched earth justice. If they wouldn't let him have his pool, then nobody would. He went to his shed. The air inside was thick, with the scent of sawdust and oil. He found the old toolbox, its metal heavy and familiar in his hands. He grabbed a crowbar, a heavy-duty wrench, and a pair of bolt cutters. He knew his way around the machinery of the pool better than anyone. He was the one who had meticulously installed every pipe, every valve, every piece of equipment. He knew exactly what made it work and what it would take to make it not. Out on the deck, with the sun beginning to set, Alex approached the pool's humming heart. The filtration pump, the complex network of PVC pipes, the valves that controlled the flow of water, it was all there, a testament to his labor. He looked at the water one last time, a perfect, serene reflection of the fading sky. He raised the wrench, his hand steady. With a sharp, metallic sound, he struck the main filtration line, the reinforced plastic cracking under the force. He moved on, tearing wires, smashing gauges, and cutting vital hoses. The hum of the pump died with a final choked gasp, replaced by the sound of gushing water and the sickening crunch of metal. His breath came in ragged gasps. He worked with a feverish, focused energy, not stopping until the entire system was a jumbled, useless ruin. The beautiful, sparkling water in the pool began to cloud, its pristine surface now a canvas for the debris and grime. He stood up, his body trembling, and looked down at what was left. The pool was still there. The water was still there. But it was broken. It was useless. The morning after, the silence was different. It wasn't the tranquil quiet of a suburban Sunday. It was the tense, coiled stillness of a standoff. Alex stood at his kitchen window, a mug of cold coffee forgotten in his hands, staring out at the wreckage. The pool, once a beacon of crystal-clear perfection, was now a cloudy, stagnant eyesore. The floating debris, leaves, a misplaced pool toy, a few stray bugs seemed to mock its former glory. The torn wires and splintered PVC pipes lay scattered like the bones of a fallen beast. A grim satisfaction settled in his gut, a cold, hard ember of triumph mixed with the fear of the inevitable fallout. He had made his stand. He had told them, in the only language they understood, that some things weren't for sale. The retribution arrived at precisely 9:17 a.m. Two pristine, white utility vans emblazoned with the HOA logo rumbled to a stop in front of his house. The doors opened with a synchronized whoosh, and out stepped Evelyn Vance, her perfectly coiffed hair a stark contrast to the casual chaos of the neighborhood. She was flanked by two burly men in matching polo shirts, one carrying a clipboard, the other a tablet. They looked less like contractors and more like bouncers for a corporate takeover. A small, morbid crowd of neighbors began to gather on the sidewalks, their gazes darting between Alex's front door and the trio of invaders. Alex watched them approach his property, a sense of icy calm replacing his morning anxiety. He met them at the edge of his driveway. "Morning, Evelyn," he said, his voice flat. Evelyn's smile was gone, replaced by a thin, dangerous line. Her eyes, usually so calculating and cold, were burning with a fury he had not yet seen. "Mr. Thompson, what in God's name did you do?" she hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper. She gestured wildly towards the backyard. "The maintenance team was scheduled to begin the survey this morning. We saw the destruction from the street." "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Alex said, his hands in his pockets, feigning ignorance. "My pool is on my property. My pool, my business." Evelyn took a step closer, her voice rising. "This is a violation of the bylaws we discussed, a blatant act of vandalism against a future community asset." "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Evelyn," Alex said, the calm in his voice a weapon. "The pool is not a community asset. It's my property. I have the right to do what I want with my property." "Not when it impacts the collective good of the neighborhood," she shot back, her face flushing crimson. The man with the clipboard was frantically scribbling notes, his pen scratching against the paper. "You deliberately damaged equipment we intended to acquire. This is not just a fine, Mr. Thompson. This is a criminal offense. We are prepared to press charges for destruction of property." "Feel free," Alex said, a dangerous flicker of a smile touching his lips. "But you might have trouble proving I vandalized something that was, at the time, still legally mine. And I promise you, any lawyer I hire will have a field day with your new bylaws and this entire shakedown." The defiance in his tone seemed to momentarily stun Evelyn. For a second, the mask of corporate ruthlessness slipped, and he saw the raw human rage of a woman whose authority had been publicly challenged. She composed herself quickly, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can break something to keep it, but you've only made this worse for yourself. This isn't about a pool anymore, Mr. Thompson. This is about principle." She turned to the man with the tablet. "Mark, get a full photographic inventory of the damage. We'll be in touch, Mr. Thompson. And just so we're clear, this will cost you more than you've ever paid for anything in your life." They turned and walked away, the heels of Evelyn's shoes clicking sharply against the pavement. The neighbors began to disperse, their quiet murmurs and furtive glances a stark reminder of his isolation. Alex went back inside, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had won the battle, but he knew the war had just begun. He had underestimated the depths of Evelyn's vindictiveness, her fierce need for control. Later that day, Lily came home from a play date. She ran through the back door, her sneakers thudding on the hardwood floor, her voice a cheerful melody. "Daddy, can we go swimming? It's so hot." Alex's stomach dropped. He had completely forgotten about her. He went out to the backyard with her, his stomach in knots. When she saw the pool, she stopped dead, her small face crumpling in confusion. Daddy? What happened to the water? It's all yucky. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around her. We had a little problem with the pipes, sweetheart. It's going to be out of commission for a little while. Oh, she said, her lip trembling. Will it be fixed soon? Can we still have our pool party with all my friends? The question was a hammer blow to his conscience. He had destroyed the pool to protect it, but in doing so, he had taken away the one thing his daughter loved most about it. He had fought a battle of principle and completely forgotten the person he was fighting for. Not for a while, sweetie, he said, his voice heavy with a regret that was deeper than his anger. But I promise, we'll figure something out. We'll go to the public pool or the beach. We'll have fun, I promise. Lily looked at him, her eyes wide and trusting. The disappointment in her gaze was more painful than any fine or threat Evelyn Vance could have thrown at him. He had traded a financial battle for an emotional one, and in that moment, he felt like he had already lost. The next morning, another certified letter arrived, this one from the HOA's legal counsel. The language was cold, precise, and devoid of any pretense. It was a cease and desist order to rebuild his pool's filtration system to code, a notice of a new and exorbitant daily fine for the unsanitary and unmaintained water feature on his property, and a notice of a lawsuit for the cost of depreciation of community resources caused by his actions. The fines alone would bankrupt him within a year. They weren't just fighting for his pool anymore. They were fighting for his house, his livelihood, and the last shred of his dignity. The injustice felt like a physical weight, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He crumpled the letter in his hand, the paper tearing with a satisfying crunch, and looked out the window. Across the street, two figures were standing near the curb, talking on cell phones and pointing in his direction. One of them was Evelyn Vance. The other was a woman he didn't recognize, but whose face was set with the same steely resolve as Evelyn's. She held a clipboard, and she was pointing not at his yard, but at the house next to his, the one with the massive, perfectly manicured lawn and the state-of-the-art sprinkler system. A fresh wave of dread washed over him. He realized with a sickening certainty that Evelyn had found her next target, and that the two of them, in their shared quest for control, were not just looking to win, they were looking to send a message. And that message was, there is no fighting the HOA. His hands shook as he watched them. He had thought his destruction of the pool was the ultimate act of defiance. He had thought he'd put an end to their plans. But they were just getting started. And in his moment of triumph, he had only given them more ammunition. The two figures across the street were a study in synchronized malevolence. Evelyn, with her sharp gestures and furious whispers, was the engine of this new campaign. The woman with the clipboard, her face a mask of cold-eyed determination, was the navigator. Alex watched them, a new, colder kind of dread settling in his gut. The raw, hot anger that had driven him to tear apart his own pool had been a desperate, solitary act. This was different. This was a calculated, methodical assault. It wasn't a fight for a single pool. It was a campaign to assert absolute control, house by house. He had been so focused on his own war that he hadn't seen the larger battle unfolding. He watched the clipboard woman meticulously jot down notes, her head tilted as she seemed to be calculating angles and measurements of the neighbor's front yard. A sickening certainty washed over him. He was a test case. He was the first to fall, and his destruction was a warning shot for what was to come. He grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, crossing the street before the pair could get into their car. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and tight. She stopped, a triumphant smirk touching her lips. The other woman, who had been focused on her tablet, looked up. Her eyes were an icy blue, as devoid of warmth as a winter sky. "Mr. Thompson," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Back for more? I would have thought you'd learned your lesson." "Who is she?" Alex asked, ignoring Evelyn and looking directly at the other woman. The woman raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. "My name is Veronica Hayes. I'm the new head of compliance for this district. I specialize in resource management." Her voice was a low, smooth purr that grated on Alex's nerves. "Resource management?" Alex scoffed. "Is that what you call it? Because it looks a lot like harassment and extortion to me." Veronica's smile was fleeting, a quick flash of teeth. "We're simply ensuring that every homeowner contributes to the collective well-being of the community. Mr. Thompson, you're an excellent example of what happens when one individual puts their selfish desires above the needs of the neighborhood." "And I'm a warning," Alex shot back. "You're using me to strong-arm the rest of the community into giving up their private property." He gestured wildly towards the house next door. "What about them? Is their sprinkler system a water feature now? Is that what you're going after next?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "The new bylaws are clear. Any non-essential water usage that is not part of the community-managed system is subject to review." "You see?" Alex said, turning his desperate gaze back to Veronica. "This isn't about pools. It's about power. It's about taking everything that isn't community-approved." Veronica shrugged, an elegant, dismissive gesture. "We work for the good of the majority, Mr. Thompson. The majority has spoken." She turned and got into the passenger seat of one of the vans. "You're wrong," Alex said to Evelyn, his voice a fierce, defiant whisper. "You haven't won. Not yet. You just made an enemy out of me and a lot of other people." Evelyn simply smiled a venomous, satisfied smile and got into the driver's seat. The vans pulled away, leaving Alex alone with the silent, watchful neighborhood. He knew he had to act. He had to warn his neighbor. He walked up the driveway to the sprawling, two-story house with the perfect lawn. The front door opened before he could knock. Mr. Harrison, a man in his late 60s with a face weathered by decades of gardening and a permanent tan, stood in the doorway. He looked surprised to see Alex. "Alex," he said, his voice a low rumble, "what can I do for you?" "You need to know what they're doing," Alex said, not wasting any time on pleasantries. "Evelyn and her new head of compliance. We're just out here taking notes on your lawn." Mr. Harrison's brows furrowed in confusion. "My lawn? What for?" "They're going after your sprinkler system," Alex said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They're reclassifying all private water usage as non-essential under their new bylaws. My pool was just the beginning. They're going to force you to turn off your sprinklers and use a community-managed system, and then they'll fine you until you comply." Mr. Harrison laughed, a deep, mirthless sound. "Nonsense, Alex. My lawn is the best on the street. No HOA could touch it. I've lived here for 40 years. I helped build this community. They know better." "They don't care," Alex insisted, his voice rising in frustration. "They don't care about what you've built. They care about what they can take. They said it themselves. They work for the good of the majority, which means they can do whatever they want. They're using me as a test case." Mr. Harrison looked from Alex's face to the cloud-filled, stagnant pool in his backyard. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. That's insane." "It's not," Alex said. "It's their plan, and if we don't fight them together, they'll win." He spent the next hour laying out everything: the first letter, the rigged meeting, Evelyn's threats, the destruction of his pool, the lawsuit, and the crushing fines. Mr. Harrison listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. By the time Alex was finished, the older man's face was ashen. "My wife. She'll be heartbroken," Mr. Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "She spends all day taking care of that garden. It's her pride and joy." A new, terrible rage began to build in his eyes, a fire that matched Alex's own. "They can't do this." "They can," Alex said, "unless we stop them." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, the copy of the lawsuit from the HOA. "I've been doing some digging. The bylaws they're referencing were approved at that last meeting, the one where they got everyone to sign off on the plan. But I found a section in the original town-filed HOA charter, a loophole. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened with a flicker of hope. What is it? The original charter states that any bylaw amendment that results in the confiscation or devaluation of a homeowner's primary residence or property must be ratified by a 90% vote of all homeowners, not just the people who show up at the meeting. And the approval must be in a formal, notarized document, not a hastily scrawled signature on a clipboard. Alex looked at his neighbor, a glimmer of a plan taking shape in his mind. We can challenge the legality of their vote. We can get a judge to nullify their new bylaws. We can get them on a technicality. Mr. Harrison looked at him, a wide, slow smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who saw not just a plan, but a chance for payback. He extended his hand, and Alex shook it. So we fight back, Mr. Harrison said, his voice a low, determined growl. But we don't do it by tearing things up. We do it by playing their game and winning. A few days later, a new flyer began to circulate in the neighborhood. It was not a glossy, official HOA memo. It was a simple, photocopied piece of paper titled, "Your property is under attack." It outlined the HOA's plan in simple, direct terms, detailing the legal loophole Alex had found and calling for a community-wide meeting at a neutral location, the local library, to vote on a motion to formally challenge Evelyn and her new compliance officer in court. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. The emotional stakes had been raised. This was no longer just a war between a single homeowner and the HOA. It was a full-blown rebellion. Tuesday night, the community room at the library was packed. Every chair was taken, and people stood along the walls. The air buzzed with a shared, nervous energy. Alex and Mr. Harrison stood at the front, a shared sense of purpose radiating from them. Suddenly, the double doors swung open, and Evelyn Vance strode in, flanked by her two goons and, of course, Veronica Hayes. Evelyn's face was livid with rage. She had underestimated the rebellion. She had assumed that by crushing Alex, she had silenced the neighborhood. But she had only given it a voice. Her eyes locked on Alex, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated fury. She had started a war, and Alex was about to show her that he wasn't the only one who had been fighting. The double doors of the library's community room groaned shut behind Evelyn Vance and her entourage, the sound a final, definitive period on the buzzing energy of the crowd. The room, which moments before had been a sea of nervous anticipation, fell into a tense, expectant silence. Evelyn's face, a mask of cold fury, scanned the room, her gaze lingering on Alex and Mr. Harrison standing at the front. The two burly men who flanked her seemed to physically expand, their posture a silent threat. Behind them, Veronica Hayes, the head of compliance, stood with an unnerving stillness, her icy blue eyes taking in every detail with the detached scrutiny of a predator. Evelyn was the first to break the silence. "I find this gathering to be in gross violation of our established community protocols," she announced, her voice echoing with the brittle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is an unsanctioned meeting called by an individual who has repeatedly demonstrated a disregard for the well-being of this neighborhood. We will not be participating in this farce." A murmur of protest rippled through the crowd. Alex stepped forward, his own heart pounding against his ribs, a mixture of fear and adrenaline coursing through him. "This is a public space, Evelyn," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And this is a community matter. You had your chance to address this at the last meeting. You chose to use that meeting to ram through a power grab. Now it's our turn." Evelyn's smirk returned, razor-sharp and full of contempt. "Your turn? You're a man who, in a fit of pique, destroyed a valuable community asset and now faces thousands of dollars in fines and a lawsuit. Are you truly the person you want to represent your interests? She gestured to the projector screen behind him, where a picture of his murky, debris-filled pool had suddenly appeared. Look at this. This is what happens when one person's selfish desires contaminate the entire neighborhood. He's not a hero. He's a vandal. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mixture of shock and unease. Evelyn was a master of public shaming, and she was weaponizing his desperation. Alex felt his resolve waver, but then he caught Mr. Harrison's eye. The older man gave him a firm, reassuring nod. "The pool is on my property, Evelyn," Alex said, his voice gaining strength. "And at the time I destroyed it, it was my property, not the community's. But you're right. This isn't about a pool anymore." He looked out at the faces in the crowd, at his neighbors, some of whom had averted their eyes from his for weeks. "This is about the fact that you're using my situation to set a precedent. You're telling every one of us that you can take our property, our homes, anything you deem non-essential, and there's nothing we can do about it. You call it resource management, but we know what it is. It's control." He gestured to the screen behind him, and the image of his pool was replaced by a digital copy of the original HOA charter, the section Alex had found highlighted in bright yellow. "I've lived here for 40 years, Mr. Harrison said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through the tension. "My wife and I built this life here, and in all that time I never thought I'd have to remind our HOA president of the very document she was sworn to uphold." He took over the podium, his presence calming the room. "As our neighbor, Mr. Thompson, has painstakingly discovered, our original town-filed charter requires a 90% vote of all homeowners to approve any amendment that would result in the confiscation or devaluation of a homeowner's primary residence or property." He looked directly at Evelyn. "That's what you did, Evelyn. You passed a bylaw to devalue our homes, and you did it with a simple majority of the people who showed up at a single meeting. That's not what we signed up for." The murmurs grew into an angry clamor. People began to talk, whispering about their own homes, their own property, their own fears. A woman in the front row, whose meticulously cared-for garden was her life's work, stood up and pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn. "My prize-winning roses aren't non-essential. You're not taking them." Evelyn, sensing the tide turning against her, leaned forward, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "This is ridiculous. This is a clear misinterpretation of the charter. This man is trying to stir up trouble to get out of paying his fines. He's a con artist, and he's using your goodwill to get what he wants." She turned to Veronica. "Veronica, if you would explain to the room the technical limitations of their argument." Veronica stepped forward, her posture as straight and unyielding as a marble column. "The bylaws in question were legally approved in accordance with a majority vote of those in attendance," she stated, her voice devoid of inflection. "The specific clause Mr. Harrison is referring to is often interpreted in legal precedent as pertaining to full-scale eminent domain, not simple reclassification of community resources. Your argument, while emotionally charged, has no legal standing. Your motion is invalid." A disheartened sigh went through the room. Alex's shoulders slumped. They had thought they had found a silver bullet, but Veronica's cold, legalistic response seemed to deflate their hopes. "That's not true," a voice from the back of the room shouted. The crowd parted, and a young man in a worn business suit walked forward. "I'm a lawyer, and I specialize in property law. And what Mr. Harrison is saying is absolutely correct. That clause is designed to protect homeowners from exactly this kind of overreach. A simple majority of those present is not sufficient to change the fundamental structure of our property rights. They need a 90% vote of every homeowner in the neighborhood. They don't have it. Their new bylaws are null and void." A wave of astonished relief and a roar of triumphant cheers erupted from the crowd. Evelyn's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, crumpled. She looked at Veronica, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and panic. Veronica's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of something other than cold detachment. She had been bested, and it wasn't by Alex, but by a legal technicality she had, in her arrogance, overlooked. Evelyn threw her hands up. "This is preposterous! I will not stand for this! This meeting is adjourned!" She turned and stormed toward the door, her goons trailing behind her, their faces contorted in furious confusion. But before she could reach the exit, a voice stopped her cold. "No, it's not," said a woman's voice, low and firm. The crowd parted to reveal the source. A small, unassuming woman with a gentle face, her hand resting on the shoulder of the young lawyer. "I'm a notary public, and before this meeting began, I witnessed every one of us sign a petition to validate this meeting and this vote." She held up a clipboard full of signatures. The weight of the moment was heavy in the air. Evelyn had lost her power, she had lost her control, and she had lost her war. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and pure, unadulterated defeat. Her body was a rigid, trembling statue of a tyrant who had just been overthrown. The crowd stared at her, not with anger, but with a quiet, satisfied victory. The silence was more deafening than any noise. It was the silence of justice. Suddenly, Veronica, who had been standing with her back to the room, turned and looked at Evelyn. Her eyes, devoid of any sympathy, held only a cold, calculating analysis of a lost cause. She took a step back from Evelyn, and then another, her movement a silent, brutal declaration that she was no longer with her. She had seen the writing on the wall. She had seen that her loyalty was to the winning side, and that the winning side was no longer Evelyn's. She turned, gave the crowd a quick, curt nod, and walked out the door, leaving a stunned, abandoned Evelyn standing alone, in the middle of the crowded room. The silence that followed Veronica's exit was heavier than any sound. It wasn't just the quiet of a stunned crowd. It was the deafening silence of a broken rein. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the room, a statue of pure, unadulterated defeat. Her goons, lost and bewildered, looked from her to the crowd, their expressions a comical mix of confusion and fear. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, who had used bureaucracy and intimidation as weapons, was now just a woman in a nice suit, abandoned by her own lieutenants. The triumph in the room was palpable, a shared, silent victory. That felt more profound than any cheering. Finally, Mr. Harrison broke the quiet. He walked over to Evelyn, his face softened by a kind of pitying exhaustion. "Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle, "it's over. Go home." Evelyn's eyes, wide with shock, slowly focused on him. A flicker of her old rage returned, a final desperate gasp. "This isn't over, Harold. Not by a long shot. You've just signed your own death warrant. The fines, the lawsuit, they're still valid. You think you've won? You've only delayed the inevitable." Her voice, though still tinged with venom, lacked its usual brittle authority. It was the sound of a hollow threat. The legal standing for those fines and the lawsuit was based on a bylaw that has now been shown to be null and void, Alex said, stepping forward. "We've recorded this entire meeting. Your goons, your new head of compliance, your own words. They're all on record. The moment you walk out that door, we're filing a motion to have everything you've levied against me dismissed. And we'll win, because you don't have a legal leg to stand on anymore." Evelyn stared at him, her lips trembling with a fury so deep it bordered on the psychotic. But Alex's words, so calm and so final, seemed to snap something inside her. The last vestiges of her defiance crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and a single, solitary tear traced a path through the perfectly applied foundation on her cheek. The crowd watched, transfixed, as the formidable Evelyn Vance, the woman they had all feared and silently resented, finally broke. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her two flummoxed goons scrambling to catch up. The crowd erupted in a roar of cheers. People surged forward, their faces alight with an excitement that was part relief, part shared victory. Hands clapped Alex and Mr. Harrison on the back. The young lawyer from the back of the room, whose name was Mark, shook Alex's hand. "You had them on the ropes from the beginning," he said, a wide grin on his face. "I just helped them find their footing." Alex felt a wave of dizzying relief. The weight he had been carrying for weeks, the constant gnawing anxiety, lifted, replaced by an exhaustion so profound he could barely stand. He and Mr. Harrison spent the next hour talking to a dozen different neighbors, all of them apologizing for their silence, all of them offering to help. A group of men, including Mr. Harrison, even volunteered to come over the next day to help him fix his pool. The victory was sweeter than he could have ever imagined, not because he had won a fight, but because he had found a community again. When he got home, his house was silent. The living room was empty. The pool was still a murky mess. But something had changed. The air was no longer thick with the tension of a looming conflict. It was filled with the quiet, hopeful hum of a new beginning. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Harrison, wearing a pair of old jeans and carrying a toolbox. Within the hour, his yard was filled with a dozen neighbors, all with tools, all with a shared purpose. They worked side by side, talking, laughing, telling stories. The pool, which had been a symbol of Alex's isolation and defiance, was now a symbol of community and collective action. They didn't just fix the pump, they upgraded the entire filtration system, installed new lights, and even re-tiled a few sections. They worked until the sun set, and by the time they left, the pool was once again filled with clean, sparkling water. That night, Lily ran out into the backyard, her face a beacon of pure joy. "Daddy, it's fixed. The water's all clean." She jumped in, splashing and giggling with a happiness that was more precious to Alex than all the money in the world. He watched her swim, his heart full. He had done it. He had protected their home. He had fought a monster, and he had won. He had his life back. His victory felt so complete that he almost missed the small, insignificant detail that appeared on his front porch the next morning. It was an official-looking envelope, not from the HOA, but from a law firm he didn't recognize. Inside, a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a fine or a lawsuit, but a legal notice. It stated that Veronica Hayes, the former head of compliance, had filed a petition with the city council to annex the community, which would dissolve the HOA and place the neighborhood under the city's jurisdiction, thereby invalidating any of the old charter's protections. Her statement, attached to the petition, was simple and chillingly logical. The HOA has proven itself incapable of effective self-governance. For the safety and well-being of its residents, it is time for the city to step in. The paper trembled in Alex's hand. He had been so focused on defeating Evelyn's clumsy power grab that he had completely underestimated Veronica. He had seen her as a mere pawn, a cold-eyed opportunist. But she wasn't just an opportunist. She was a master strategist, a predator who had simply been biding her time. While Evelyn was busy with her petty vendettas, Veronica was quietly planning to burn the entire neighborhood to the ground and build it again under her own terms. Evelyn's defeat had been a sideshow. Veronica was playing a completely different game, a game with consequences that went far beyond a single pool or a single homeowner. The real enemy was still out there, and she had just started her real war.